Neale and Brigitte are with us now. Neale Jones, who was Chief of Staff to Labour Leader Jacinda Ardern, prior to that Chief of Staff to Andrew Little, is now Director of the public affairs firm Capital. Morena.
Good morning.
Brigitte Morten is a Director with public and commercial law firm Franks Ogilvie, a former senior ministerial advisor for the previous National-led government, a National Party member, and who volunteers during elections for its Deputy Leader, Nicola Willis. Last week, the tariffs seem to be on a scale beyond people's worst nightmares, really. It essentially seems to be taking whatever the trade differential is, and if it runs against the United States, you get slapped with a bigger tax. That's effectively what it is. It's a tax on the two-way trade differential.
It's not even full trade, it's just goods. So US is a very services-heavy economy, but they've just taken goods. So it's not even accurate in that way.
Right.
Well, also it's questionable whether it actually was AI generated, hence why we've got some penguins getting taxed.
Yeah.
ChatGPT, come up with some tariffs for the world.
I think it might have been Elon Musk's 22-year-olds from Doge feeding things into ChatGPT. So not a great way to, make policy that affects the entire world, but this is where we live now.
The scale is profound, and let's just work through Winston Peters' magnificent, putting a smile on it. We got the least bad, but that's just for the immediate headline tariff. What happens when countries that are big trading partners for us lower their GDP and lower their demand for our goods? That's when it's really going to hurt,
Well, it's not good, is it, Catherine? Like, if the US starts going to recession and the world starts going to recession and starts heading to trade war, for a small country that's trade dependent and relies on a rules-based international order, that's a terrible thing. Moreover, I think it really accelerates that sort of decline of the US hegemony that we've been seeing since Trump came in. We've already seen sort of geopolitically, we've seen the alliances start to fray over things like Ukraine. We've seen as threats to NATO allies, and now we're starting to see the breakdown of that global economic order, and that means we saw the remarkable sight, I think it was last week, of Japan, South Korea, and China looking at doing trade deals in response, which you couldn't imagine three more unlikely allies. So I think we'll start to see more and more chaos and disorder globally as a result of this if the US keeps it up, and that's only bad news for New Zealand in every regard. I was also going to say I think Winston did a pretty good job trying to get us a good deal. I just think he probably didn't count on the fact that it was a large language model that was deciding this in the end, and so nothing he did had any impact because it was just absurd the whole way down.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think Winston absolutely did the best that we could expect, and in part, getting just to 10% is a reflection of the fact that we have not clearly either angered Trump or the AI model as such. That looks like a triumph. I was a little bit disappointed by sort of former Trade Minister Damien O'Connor's sort of petty comments that clearly Winston hadn't done a great job, but I saw that Chris Hipkins, as the leader, sort of corrected that, and we've gone back to our strong bipartisan approach.
We're not exactly at the front of the queue for conversations right now.
In many ways we don't want to be, because you can see the people or the countries that are at the front of the queue are the ones that got hit the hardest. So this kind of keep our heads down strategy does seem to be working to the best it can, but
more on that from Phil Goff in a moment, but anyway, carry on.
So I think absolutely the government has done what they can. I mean, we never expected to be in a situation where we'd find out from our tariffs by trying to zoom in on a poster being held up by the US president. It's just extraordinary. This is not how we normally engage diplomatically, and so as Neale said, I think this is going to have some real changes to our sort of geographical puzzle.
Yeah. The question is whether this is a case of you see them now and then you don't. But, even if there's a few months till full impact for New Zealand, the clock starts ticking now, right? And, it's hard to see a sudden backtrack on, what's been announced about goodness knows how many dozen countries, as opposed to when it was Mexico and Canada and 1 minute it was on and the next minute it was off.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. We're starting to see some Republican senators starting to, speak up on this. Even Ted Cruz, who, Donald Trump personally insulted his wife's looks and he still became his greatest supporter. So, this is a man who's not afraid of bowing down to Trump, and yet he's speaking up on this because a lot of Republicans are afraid that if this leads to recession and higher costs, which it probably will, that's going to punish them in the midterms. And so it could be that domestically there's a bit of pushback. Elon Musk's pushing back on it now.
He wants a free trade zone with EU. But isn't it ridiculous that we're talking about an unelected person who was given some kind of made-up job and now is probably leaving it to go back and run his company, and talking about that as if that's going to be a key factor in what happens here?
It's all ridiculous. I mean, none of this makes any sense. I think there's very little New Zealand can do to impact this. I think domestic politics in the US will have the biggest impact. And I think we just have to see it as a 10% cost of doing business for the foreseeable future.
Well, the worst part, though, is not that 10% upfront cost. It's what happens when... I mean, look at some of those Southeast Asian nations and what they have been hit with. Not insignificant trading partners with us, right? Well, China, a much bigger player, itself taking a heavy hit. Japan taking a heavy hit. That is going to affect the discretionary income available for demand for our goods and services.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it's changing that conversation around tariffs. So we've seen tariffs, or the implementation of tariffs, slowly creeping up over the last decade. I think there was sort of 1% of goods that had a tariff on them sort of about 10 years ago, and we're getting closer to that 8-9% before this sort of happened. So
this is before the trade war really takes off.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we get heavy... China has responded, but EU yet to respond.
Yeah, and so you can see a situation. So the EU was one of those bodies that was sort of looking at those tariffs and more, subsidies, so not tariffs, but very similar type, impact on trade tools. I think if they've got the kind of the license that they can then start implementing this, it's going to be harder and harder for us to have that free trade arrangement that we have tried to fight for basically for the last 40 years. And that's, I think, going to be the lasting damage beyond whatever Trump's time in office is.
I mean, what's our dependence? What's our GDP dependence on exports? Is it still over 50%? This is the thing. The United States is an enormous country and predominantly a domestically driven economy.
And also,
this is where we are so vulnerable.
Yeah, in particular industries. Red meat is a big exporter, to the US, so they're going to be particularly, hard hit. And so there's very little the government can do to actually, minimise the impact on them.
It does feed into our next story, which is, we are awaiting fairly soon I always get the names of this confused, the defence decision-making, basically, on what the shape of the Defence Force and investment is going to be. Capability plan. Suspected to have been delayed, not surprisingly, given some of the events of this year, but also seen as imminent. And that's going to carry a big price tag, potentially. But also, the question comes down to this, and you've made this point in the past, changing the relationship with the US on all fronts. So let's talk about Phil Goff breaking his silence, multiple times it has to be said, in a series of interviews. Having lost his job for what he said under Chatham House rules. He's saying in interviews, I knew I was coming right to the line. I would have done it anyway, frankly, was what he said. Do we have any ability in the diplomatic sphere or the political sphere to say the things that he said?
So the appropriate people to be saying these things and making those decisions are our Prime Minister, Foreign Minister and Trade Minister. It is absolutely not for someone in the diplomatic corps to be making these statements. But they're not
making these statements either, and neither are they going to.
But what I'm saying is that, on the Phil Goff issue to begin with, I don't think that is our way that we should be doing it. He has sort of kind of in hindsight made these statements that people weren't calling out the emperor with no clothes type approach. Lots of people were calling out Trump. I don't think anything he did was actually leading to make any difference. So if you take that into context and think about what do we want from our leadership in terms of engaging with the US, we always know that we've got this tough balance to be had between our export and trade and our beliefs, let's say, on human rights and morals and ethics. At the moment, the big thing is, I think we go back to we're putting our head down, because if we do anything, we're actually going to cause way more of that balance. We're going to cause way more pain to ourselves than actually any benefit we're going to get or people in the US or our trade partners are going to get.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think what Phil Goff said over the weekend was entirely right. Like, Trump is a bully. If the world doesn't stand up to bullies, then bullies just run riot. It's the same in the playground as it is in geopolitics. And the US, he is behaving shockingly. He was terrible to Zelensky. He's a liar. All this stuff is true that Goff said. I do agree that you can't run a foreign policy if diplomats are off saying their own thing. That's the job of politicians. And if you want to be a politician, you stand for election and you be a politician. So, I think Winston was entirely correct to remove him from his position. The thing I would say, though, is if New Zealand is going to take that approach of pushing back on Trump, it would have to be as part of a large collective group of nations. If you're the smallest kid in the playground, you don't stand up to the bully by yourself because you get your head smacked in. You have to get a coalition of people, and you have to do it collectively, and you can't do that if you have a diplomat sort of off on their own tangent.
I sort of want to move forward from what happened in London, because what happened. It's more at what point the ability to keep your head down and say nothing gets tested, right? But it's an interesting point you make. If and when the decision is made that a stand has to be taken or a statement has to be made, We shouldn't be running out ahead of what? Others, like-minded partners, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be honest, if it's anyone pushing back, it'll be the EU, it'll be Japan, it'll be South Korea, it'll be traditional US allies and friends saying this isn't working, we need to reset this. And I think New Zealand, at the very most, comes in behind supportively, but we shouldn't be sticking our head up right now. Because not only have we got off very lightly so far, even if it is just the chat GPT that's done it for us, there is a risk that we put our head up and it gets smacked off, and that doesn't help anyone.
Yeah. I mean, Goff's reference was to history, and to one point in history in particular.
Yeah,
if we're not there yet, we hope we don't get there.
The
right?
analogy is very real. And so, for example, he was talking about Ukraine at the time, and obviously New Zealand should be supporting Ukraine.
He was talking about appeasement, what happens with appeasement, essentially.
Yeah, and but like the specific historical reference was, I think, around Czechoslovakia, comparing that to Ukraine. And yes, we should be supporting Ukraine, just as the British and the French should have backed Czechoslovakia in 1938. But when it comes to things like tariffs and all the other things, New Zealand shouldn't stand alone. We don't have that capacity.
Let's come home. The Treaty Principles Bill was reported back on Friday, several weeks earlier. I don't think it was due back to me. We were trying to establish with the Leader of the House whether we might see that bill back in the House for its second reading, which is anticipated to be a vote down, of course, as soon as this week. Have we had any further clarity? Or
not as far as I'm aware, but I mean, the lack of clarity about who did what and which parts, which motion and which submissions, all on the public record. I mean, the amount of political posturing that has gone over the last week over this report has been quite extraordinary.
Talk us through it a bit.
Well, I can't tell you every detail because I get confused about who said what.
I tried to last night, and I actually put into AI to try and explain it, and I was more confused.
Well, you saw how well that went elsewhere, but anyway.
I think essentially, you see that the ACT Party wanted a full submission kind of process, and then they were going to sort of report back, earlier, and so therefore all of the submissions haven't been processed, therefore they're not on the official record. So there was a question about what was going to be in the official record and what was not. I think they came to the right conclusion at the end of the day, that reporting back now is efficient, they've got all those main views in there, but making sure that everyone's submission is into that record, because that is important, that people feel like they have been heard. But we knew always from the start of this that this bill was always going to be voted down. So I just don't want to waste any more of Parliament's time going back and forth over motions, and Dr Duncan Webb from Labour, doing this motion, then backflipping and then changing policy. It's just a complete waste of time, and we've got no further forward.
But the question is whether that bill gets back to the House and is presumably voted down this week, because, it is in the hands of the Leader of the House, with agreement and negotiation with other parties, what lands on the order paper when. National just wants it gone, doesn't it?
I think they should kill it as soon as they possibly can. I mean, my views on this have been expressed many times on this show, but I think the parliamentary shenanigans are of no interest to me, and I think 98% of the public. I think this is a bill that is based on a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of what the treaty is. I think that it's from a party that has 8% support. It should have gone no further than being an ACT Party MP's members bill that got voted down at first reading. The fact it has gone so far has been extremely damaging to our social fabric. I think it's brought out the worst elements in society. Okay. And I think that actually it is a historic failure of leadership by Christopher Luxon, who was politically naive and I think arrogant in thinking and not seeking the advice or not listening to the advice of people like John Key or Chris Finlayson or Bill English, who would have told him never to allow this to go forward. And I think now we need to do a bit of healing. I think it's an opportunity. I think Christopher Luxon, he never wanted this to be his legacy. And I think he has an opportunity to reset for Crown Māori relations, to cut out some of this culture war stuff that goes on, and to start to rebuild and heal, because we actually need that as a country. We look overseas, and the kind of peace we have as a country, in a multi-ethnic country that has a legacy of colonialism that sits with us to this day, we're lucky. A lot of other countries have had a lot of disorder around that, and I think it's really important that he steps up.
Okay, National will just want it gone, Brigitte. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we look at sort of that social licence and where we're at, I mean, the biggest winners out of this entire process has been Te Pāti Māori. And I think in some ways it's actually legitimised some of their behaviour in terms of Parliament, and we'll turn to that shortly, I'm sure. But I think for Te Pāti Māori, they want this to be extended out. It's not a bad look for Labour also, which I think is probably why we had that political posturing from Duncan Webb. But that for them to kind of expand it out, because there's all these sort of issues that Neale has raised about how the fact that National wants to go away because it doesn't reflect well on their ability to manage the narrative. So, yeah, I mean, I would be pushing for it to be done this week, but I imagine that every speaking opportunity will be taken every time that they, to really make that announcement. It'd be really interesting to see how Te Pāti Māori behaves in the House on this one.
The Privileges Committee, just remind us what happened with respect to Te Pāti Māori and the Privileges Committee hearing into the haka that was carried out when this bill was introduced all those months ago.
It was, and most importantly, it was done at the point in which a vote was being taken, which is a pretty serious point in terms of the rules of the House, and this is very insider, parliamentary process, but actually interrupting a vote is a very serious thing because that is ultimately the point in which decisions are made in Parliament. So, as I understand it, basically the Privileges Committee, and there's some, once again, contesting about what the facts are not accommodating for them to have their lawyers' availability taken into account and for them to appear together, Te Pāti Māori, the 3 MPs, which to me, I don't, frankly, on that second point, understand. Why would you not just allow that to occur? But I suspect there's some other issues going on behind the scenes as well.
Yeah. Look, I think you're right, Bridget, that it is a clear breach of parliamentary, protocol when there's a vote taking place particularly. I think, given the extraordinary nature of the issue, I think an extraordinary response was probably appropriate, even if it was in breach of the rules. When I saw that haka, I couldn't help finding it a bit inspiring, and I think if the Privileges Committee were to have Te Pāti Māori appear in front of them, they'd probably respond very similarly to the way they did with Peni Henare, where they said, he said he didn't resolve from doing it, but he recognises he broke the rules and he apologised for that, and that was the end of it.
And that he would do it differently
next
time.
And maybe if there is an issue around how the House needs to more appropriately take into account tikanga, that's a conversation to have afterwards.
The vote was the issue, and Audrey Young, who's watched a Privileges Committee meeting or two and has watched the House for quite a few years, New Zealand Herald's Audrey Young, saying the same thing. The House has become more flexible. We've had haka when we've had significant legislation passed. We've had haka from the or waiata from the public gallery, for example, but the vote, the sanctity of the vote was the issue. But again, Te Pāti Māori is getting this opportunity to keep making its statement as well.
And I think it works for them. So, I mean, as much as they talk about the powerful Privileges Committee, I think the TikTok algorithm is far more powerful. And I think for Te Pāti Māori, whether it's Rawiri Waititi being able to wear Air Jordans in the House or not wear a tie in the House, or this is a way for Te Pāti Māori to show themselves fighting against the colonial institution of Parliament on social media. It racks up their base and it works for them.
Okay, the Greens' handling of the latest MP controversy, this was breaking in the mainstream media, mainstream awareness anyway, around this time last week actually, after a weekend of ferocious social media activity amongst devotees to political social media. What's happened since with terms of MP Benjamin Doyle's situation? Still away from the House. No comment on when returning following threats. But there has been a lot of criticism of the Greens' own handling of this, would we say, nuanced situation.
Yeah, I think they took a sledgehammer to something in which they should have been way more nuanced. Nobody agrees with death threats against anyone, let alone people who put themselves into the public arena and MPs. We know that there's been increasing amounts of violence, threatened against MPs over the last 5 years, and this is yet another example. But the Greens' position on this, in which they refuse to acknowledge that Benjamin Doyle's behaviour was offensive to the vast majority of New Zealanders.
It was on a private Instagram
There's
account.
There's no such thing as a private Instagram account when you're a politician.
Forgive me, a personal, being a politician, but nonetheless.
Every single politician will close down their personal accounts, particularly one with a title like that or a handle like that. There is absolutely no excuse for that continuing, and there's no excuse for those particular words being used in context with children, even though I completely see that it was not intended.
The argument was it may have been a file with that title or whatever. Look, on and on and on.
Yeah, all those kind of things. But all those things, they should recognise that. That is part of your job as a community leader, which you are as an MP, to make sure that you are upstanding and having that leadership. And I think the Greens, and you've seen it, so a number of pieces, and I've heard it from my friends as well, that actually by the Greens coming out and saying that actually this is the irreverent use that people outside the rainbow community don't understand, actually smears a lot of the rainbow community. You'll be like, no, that is a crass sexual term that they would not use just in normal daily language, let alone anywhere near a child. And I think that's where they got it completely wrong, because they've just failed to acknowledge with even their own base that actually there was an issue to be addressed here.
Yeah, look, I think it is important in the context of what Brigitte was saying, to note that the reaction on the other side was completely disproportionate. I think there were some very wild allegations made against Benjamin Doyle, frankly, in my view, potentially defamatory in some cases. People drawing some very strong views and very strong allegations from very thin evidence. And obviously that's had a pretty devastating effect on a brand new MP. And some of that language was actually, some of those terms used against him were drawing on well-known homophobic tropes. But going to the political management aspect, it's basic political management for any political party that if you have a new candidate, or particularly if they're an MP, you look at their social media accounts, you vet it and you think, how might my worst enemy use this? And then how might just an average person seeing it on social media or in the news react to it? And then you have to start to lock it down and you start preparing your response and knowing that it might come and manage it. And I think what it looks like happened is that they just kind of let it run and it ended up arriving in the worst way possible, which is angry, insane social media
also
bile.
then the deletion started happening once the buzz on social media was happening, which just doubles down on the whole.
So I think for the Greens it's just probably a reminder of some basic political hygiene.
Yeah. Very interesting column by Andrew Advance at the weekend about its timing, which of course we had the announcements about ferries on Monday, and we had Mr. Peters speaking separately about the ferries and separately about this on the same day. Very quickly on the ferries. Don't expect to see any funding for this in this year's budget, do we? Given we're now talking rail enabled and we don't know what the infrastructure costs are going to be, and we don't really know a heck of a lot more, except he seems to have won the argument over rail enablement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they will be seeing this as a settlement of the issue, because most people will have seen that as an announcement that we're getting ferries by this date. There's infrastructure happening on the Picton side. There's a bit of stuff happening on the Wellington side. I think for most people, the back and forth of ferries is something that they just want sorted because they want to be able to get on the Inter-Islander and get there.
Not sure that it
Christmas.
was sorted last Monday.
No,
but anyway.
but that's what I'm saying is, though, that I think for the most part they have reclaimed some of that narrative back, but they still have to actually prove that, as you say, by what actually money gets spent and that managing those cost blowouts.
I should note that the firm I work for has done some work in the ferry space, but not related to this. Look, I do think that it was a win for Winston in the sense that he's got ferry enablement, but it is an open question about what that looks like. And he makes the point that it's commercial confidentiality, et cetera, but the reality is we don't know how much it's going to cost. We don't know what it's going to look like. And
the councils want to know who's going to pay.
Yeah, we don't know who's going to pay. And once you add up all the cancellation fees and penalty fees and all these things, how's it going to look? And we'll only know that when it all comes out.